You're listening to 94.4 FM Salford City Radio, the Friday Sports Show.
You're listening to 94.4 FM Salford City Radio, the Friday Sports Show, with your host Jimmy Petruzzi, bringing you news from the local area and around the world. And the aim of the show is to increase participation and awareness of different sports, and being very fortunate in this show to have interviewed some of the world's best athletes, sports people, footballers, coaches, trainers, people across all different roles in sport. And we also have a segment which we interview some of the world's most influential people in the field of psychology and related fields, who are kind enough to join the show and share insights into their ideas around mental health and related fields. Today we have a very special guest who's going to give a really interesting insight into the world of boxing, music as well, and also what it is to be a resilience and wellness coach. She's a former IBO world champion, a former WBC Silver Champion, a professional musician, and is a resilience and wellness consultant for Seven Futures. Hannah Rankin, welcome to the show. Great to have you on board.
Oh, thank you very much for having me.
You know, it's great to have you on board, and I suppose we can sort of, if we go to the beginning, how you got into boxing. You've obviously done very well, and you know, I'm sure you can share some highlights. But if we go to the very beginning, how did you sort of get into boxing, Hannah?
So actually, I didn't get into boxing until my early 20s. I actually started when I was a lot younger. I was doing taekwondo with my sister, but my music career came first. I started off playing the flute, and then I moved on to the bassoon, and I was doing taekwondo at the same time, but I gave it up to focus on my music. I didn't get back into doing combat sports until the end of my undergraduate, and I started doing some Thai boxing. And when I moved to London to do my masters, I wanted to get fit, and I joined a gym there, and I got introduced to boxing by my boxing coach currently now as well, Noel Callan, and former heavyweight champion Derek Sweet D. Williams. They both introduced me to the sport, and I instantly fell in love with it. And I was just doing it for fitness, and then I did some white collar fights to raise money for charity. And then after that, I moved into the professional world.
It's really amazing, quite inspiring, really. At what point did you think that you could go to the very top, Hannah? I mean, you sort of join for fitness, and I suppose a lot of people, you know, listening, sort of get that. You know, you join, and you know, to keep in shape or get in shape, but then to sort of go on and achieve what you achieved, there must have been a point in where you thought, well, I've got the ability to sort of to go all the way.
Well, I love the sport because it's so, you know, there's so much to learn all the time, and I think it appeals to my nature from my musical background. I'm very good at practicing, I'm studying things, I'm performing things over and over again, and I just loved all the different things I was learning in boxing. And when I was doing so well with my white collar fights, I was winning all of them, and I was just like the thirst for knowledge of how to develop even further in the sport kind of pushed me forward, and yeah, it just kind of gripped me. And my coach obviously thought I had a bit of a talent, because I wanted to go to the next step after white collar boxing, and the natural progression would have been to go to an amateur club, but I wanted to stay with my coach and my team, and stay, you know, if you have a good teacher, you want to stay with them. So that's when I decided to go and try out professional boxing, and I did some sparring with some of the top professional females at the time in the country, and must admit it was an eye-opening experience, because I'd never been hit by a professional fighter before. So you know, but it was hard work. But I came out, and all I wanted to do was get back in there and see if I could do better and learn new things. And I think that's what appealed to my coach, is like my determination to constantly improve. And yeah, I think it was. I started being a pro to try and to see how far I could really take the sport, to see how far I could take myself, and I became world champion, and you know, that was an amazing achievement for me. So yeah, very proud of that.
I can imagine. And what would you say your highlights are? I mean, you've sort of travelled the world, you've, you know, competed against the best, and what would you say your highlights are in your career, Hannah?
I think for myself, a couple of highlights. One would be headlining famous York Hall down in London at Bethnal Green. It's one of very famous boxing venues, and it's been around for a very long time. So actually headlining a show there was a real achievement of mine, and it's still to this day probably one of my favourite venues to box in. Even though I've boxed in massive stadiums, it's probably still my favourite. And probably my biggest highlight is becoming Scotland's first ever female world champion and making history for my country when I became world champ. So yeah, that's probably my biggest achievement.
That's amazing. And what was it like to be world champion, to achieve that? What sort of, for our listeners, what's the feeling like to be a world champion?
It's overwhelming. It's one of those feelings where you've suddenly reached the pinnacle, and you can say that you're one of the best in the world or something, and that's just a crazy thought, really. Also, I got to do it at home in front of my family and my friends. It was on the BBC, and it was making history for my country. So it's kind of like, the Olympians who are out there fighting, performing for their countries in whatever sport they're doing. It's that sort of feeling. It's an amazing feeling.
I mean, I can imagine. I mean, I can only imagine. Really, I'm sure many of us can only imagine. But it's it's an incredible achievement. And I mean, I know it's probably a difficult sort of question to answer. But what would you say your strengths would be as a boxer, Hannah? What would you say your strengths are in terms of your sort of boxing career? Maybe you don't want to give away any secrets, really. But what would you say sort of was your sort of strength to sort of get you to where you were?
I think probably my discipline. I know how to work at something and practice, and I'm very disciplined with my training and my diet, and I think that's a definite probably positive of me. I'm also extremely competitive, like with myself. So I think that really helps. Is like, I just won't take no for an answer, so I've got to learn how to improve and how to get better, and so as I was coming through, I think that really helped me, like being that competitive, because I just always wanted to give the best result for myself, as a fighter, those things kind of come into the ring as well. I am very disciplined as well, but I'm very determined, and I always like to put on a show for everybody. I want people to come, and I want them to enjoy seeing me fight and get excited about it. And I think that's probably the performer in me from being a musician.
Absolutely, yeah. No, that definitely. And in terms of sort of, for our listeners to sort of, when you sort of step in that ring, what's the feeling like? I mean, I can imagine there's an adrenaline rush. I mean, if I go to like a boxing gym, and even if it's an empty ring, it's kind of, you feel a sense of adrenaline. Really, you think, wow, But to sort of have a competitor across the other side, do you get that sort of rush, Hannah, when you step in?
Absolutely, yeah. It's kind of like the adrenaline rush, the excitement, and it's also sort of an intense calm as well. Just before you do your ring walk, and before you're about to start the fight, you've touched gloves and you're standing in the corner, and I always feel a real moment of calm, because in the lead up to the fight, I've probably trained maybe up to 10 weeks of a hard work in a camp, and I put everything into that camp, and that is the moment, and I just feel very calm because I couldn't have done any more in my training. So it's that really kind of real still moment where you're like, the time is now,
Absolutely.
And it's kind of like when the red light goes on when you're in orchestra and it's the record button. It's kind of like that moment, little kind of excitement and adrenaline rush. It starts, and I'm ready to go.
It's interesting you're saying. It's almost like, I suppose, you got to coordinate that orchestra to a point where mentally. And is it? I mean, is sort of mental skills something you sort of practiced as well, or did it just come naturally to you? Obviously, you're a strong person, and you sort of the music and your sort of career, and you've done martial arts as well. And did you do specific mental skills training as well, Hannah, or were you just sort of naturally able to sort of manage your mind?
Well, actually, when I first started studying my undergraduate, I used to suffer really badly from performance anxiety, but like for solo performing, not in orchestra, but when I had to do solo things. And a lot of people said it was because I'm a very emotional person, and I wear my heart on my sleeve, and so performing in front of people, it's like you're letting people see a little part of yourself if you're really truly in the moment, and that can feel very pressurized and stressful. So I actually, in my undergraduate, I actually went for some hypnotherapy sessions to deal with the anxiety I used to feel. And actually it really helped, because what used to happen for me was I used to get rushing in my ears that I couldn't hear, and then my hands would sweat, and hypnotherapy really helped that, because it actually stopped those symptoms from happening for me. And later on, when I went to do my masters, we actually got given the option to attend classes on doing various mental exercises to focus the mind and also keep yourself calm. And I employ quite a lot of these techniques actually for my boxing now. Just like, visualizing, and I do a lot of visualization in the lead up to a fight, and also I do the same thing in the lead up to a performance, visualizing even the walk on stage, how the music's going to go, if something goes wrong, how do I recover from it? It's like all those different things you visualize, and that's a massively helpful part for me.
Brilliant.
And also various techniques for dealing with like that inner voice in your head as well.
Yeah, no, that's really, really interesting stuff, Hannah. And I suppose from a physical point of view, and training physically, sort of doing the mental skills is one thing, but training in boxing is well, at least for most people, quite challenging in some respects. But can you sort of describe what it's like to train and prepare for a fight in boxing physically?
Yeah, so for example, in the lead up to my world title fight, I had a 10-week training camp. Within that, each week you've got to do cardio training, so there's sprints and runs involved. Then also you've got to do strength training and conditioning, which is obviously weights and strengthening up various parts of the muscle groups. And then of course there's bag work and pad work with your coach, and then there's also sparring, so practice fighting effectively with various people. And that's always the fun part for me, because you get to go and work out a new opponent when you're working with them and get the rounds in and practice. So there's a lot of things to do.
I can imagine, and then it's all on the evening, and it's coordinating it all. And in terms of yourself as a musician, what can you sort of tell our sort of listeners a bit about your sort of career in music? Obviously, you've got many different talents there, and so how did you get involved in music?
Well, music was always part of my household from a very young age. My granddad was a music teacher, and my mum and her two sisters, my aunts, they all played instruments as kids, and so did myself and my two sisters. So, I was on my mum's knee at the piano from a very young age. Piano was the first thing I started on, but it wasn't the instrument for me. And I actually gave up piano to go back to my taekwondo.
Wow.
But then later on, I started on the flute, and when I was in probably about 15 at my school, a lady donated a bassoon, and that I knew that right away that was the thing I wanted to play. And as soon as I picked it up and I started learning it, I knew straight away that's the instrument for me. So I went to study my undergraduate at the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland, and then I finished my masters at the Royal Academy of Music in London. Principal study bassoon, second study contrabassoon, and I've also done my teaching certificate for that. So nowadays I freelance as a professional bassoonist and contra player with various orchestras in and around London. I've had the pleasure to travel all around the world performing, and I also teach. And I have a wind quintet called the Coriolis Quintet, and we work with a company called Live Music Now. And we go into care homes and schools, and we do lots of work, especially with people living with dementia and Alzheimer's. So it's a fantastic, really rewarding part of my job that I love.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, it's really fascinating, Hannah. Your boxing career and music as well, and I suppose in one sense there's many parallels and sort of contrasts as well. And how did you manage to sort of do both? I mean, I can imagine sort of you must have good time management, but how did you sort of managing to sort of carry on doing music and boxing as well? And
I think for me, obviously when I first started out with my boxing, I was just, the first few fights and trying things out. So they ran pretty well parallel to each other. It was very easy for me to do that. I just, picked dates when I had concerts to do things, and then when I was fighting, that was fine. But then as I've kind of risen to higher levels in my boxing career, I had to make a decision. When I'm in my training camp, I need to really focus on that. So what I tend to do is kind of I'll have all my teaching and performing, but being freelance, it means I can accept work or not accept work. So as I get closer to the fight, probably about halfway through my training camp, I'll stop doing my music stuff because I need to be fully focused on the job at hand with boxing, especially when there's titles involved and it's a quite high level. So yeah, you just have to manage it. But I mean, obviously, I'm not a full-time orchestral musician. So if I was a full-time orchestral musician, it'd be a little bit more difficult.
Absolutely, yeah, no, and in terms of, say, boxing, what sort of challenges did you face in boxing yourself, Hannah? What was sort of some of the biggest challenges that you had in your sort of boxing career?
I think at the very beginning, a lot of my friends thought I was crazy. And I definitely felt a lot of women there weren't very many female boxers when I started. There's been a huge boom recently, especially during the pandemic. We were actually very lucky to. For Matchroom Boxing and Sky Sports to put on some top female fights, one of which I was part of, and it meant that we had a captive audience here in the UK on TV, so people could actually watch women's fights. Before that, women didn't often get the airtime for their fights as well, so that was a real kind of struggle at the beginning, because especially when you're trying to find sponsorship and things like. My coach used to phone companies and say, "Oh, I've got this great boxer, and they weren't interested because I was a female." So the gender situation was quite difficult there. But nowadays things are starting to turn around for the better. But yeah, at the beginning I used to go watch fights and people would go, "Oh, it's a chicks fight, we'll go to the bar." So it's that's been a bit of a struggle, a bit of a fight, but. Definitely one of those things which are starting to change now.
Absolutely. And in terms of, like, are there any sort of boxers that inspired you, Hannah, that you sort of watch and think, you know, they're quite inspirational in themselves, or is there sort of, I mean, I've always wondered, you know, you're obviously a world champion in your own right yourself, you achieved that, and do you sort of watch other fighters and think, you know, wow, you know, they're sort of really good, and what's your sort of take on other fighters?
So I'm an absolute geek about boxing, and I love watching all the old fights on HBO, you know, Golden Boy, seeing all of those wonderful fights. I sit and watch them for hours. But, you know, obviously Sugar Ray Leonard, Arturo Gatti, these are real inspirations for me. I actually met Sugar Ray Leonard as well, so he was part of a pre-fight conversation that I had to have with the panel when I was fighting in America on DAZN, and it was just a real amazing time to meet him. But current fighters, female-wise, when I first started, I was very lucky to start sparring with Michaela Lauren, who's a Swedish boxer, 5 times world champion, and she was a huge inspiration to me, and someone that I massively looked up to. And actually, when I won my IBO world title, she just sort of retired, and it was kind of like passing on the title, having worked with her, from her to me, sort of thing. So yeah, that was a real special moment for me. It's
quite inspiring, Hannah, because you mentioned that you sort of took up boxing later on, and what was the sort of, just out of interest, what was the sort of reaction like that you took up boxing, and I suppose, you know, you put a lot of hard work into it. It was not an overnight thing, but I suppose there's people fighting for years, and then, you know, you come along and sort of, what was the feeling like? What was around you? Was it sort of, were you aware of this perception of you sort of, you know, coming along and sort of, you know, getting to the top?
Well, I think, so I think I was very lucky in some ways, having not come through the amateur system. So people didn't know me as much from there, so I didn't have that much difficulty getting sparring, because I wasn't in direct competition with any of the girls, because I decided to go pro, so it was different. So I was lucky to get sparring with quite a lot of them. I used to go up to Team GB, the Olympic team, and work with them. You know, I wasn't in direct competition, so it was never a problem for me, though I know it was quite hard for the girls sometimes when they needed sparring and didn't want to spar with a girl that they might fight later on, you know.
Of course, yeah.
And everyone was very, I think I've obviously exceeded expectations, having started so late and not come from amateur backgrounds. But, you know, I'm fully intent on going to win another world title, and hopefully that opportunity will be coming up very soon. And it's one of those things that I'm determined to achieve as best that I can achieve, and it by no means comes from like just luck. I've worked incredibly hard.
I can imagine, yeah, definitely, yeah. I mean, there's probably people, listening, thinking, "Wow," but yeah, absolutely. I mean, you've got the talent there, that's for sure. That's a given, but you've got to sort of fine tune that talent. And do you feel that you can inspire a generation? You said something sort of, aware of that. There's an opportunity here. Obviously, you've inspired people along the way, but in terms of any young people watching, thinking, "Okay, well, maybe I'll give this a go as well."
Absolutely. So I always, when I became world champion, you have a responsibility. You people look up to you, and I feel I take that responsibility very seriously. And I think it's important to encourage as many young girls and young guys who want to get into the sport to give it a go, because it's a fantastic sport. It's great fun, and also you meet some incredible people from all around the world. And it doesn't matter where you're from or what background you have. If you walk into a boxing gym and you want to work hard, people just accept you. That's part of it. And I think it's a great sport to be involved in. But also, especially nowadays for young girls, it is an opportunity. It is reality. You can follow a boxing career as a young woman, and that you will, you can be successful at it, and there will be opportunities for you. Whereas when I started, that might not have felt like it was the case. So I'm always trying to say to people, yes, by all means, contact me to ask me about things. I'm right here at the end of any social media for questions, because I started at the bottom with nothing, and where I've got to now with a great team around me, and people supported me. So I want to be supportive to them.
No, that's really great that you do that, and I think that's fantastic. And obviously, having achieved that sort of the top of the career yourself, I think that's great that you put back, and that's a great thing, really. And I know it's difficult to, any young person sort of listening, thinking, okay, it's not easy to sort of give any advice, but maybe sort of suggestion, thinking they want to take it up. Some people might be a little bit intimidated to go to a boxing gym for whatever reason, and what would you say to someone sort of considering going to a boxing gym? Obviously, there's no two boxing gyms the same, but if they're considering it, Hannah, but they're a bit intimidated to go in and they're not quite sure, what would you sort of suggest that they do?
I would suggest that you should definitely try it out, because the people are actually very friendly in the gym. If you turn up with a great attitude, you want to work hard, and you're willing to give everything in training, and people really respect that. And also, it's often not that expensive to go to your local amateur club. Maybe £5 for the subs or something like that these days. So give it a go. It's a great way to get fit and meet great people. So I think it's one of those things, like, take a leap of faith, because you'd be surprised at how nice people are and how much you really will enjoy the sport and the people around it.
Absolutely. I mean, I always suggest, like, I sort of do some work in football, and I suggest that the players in the off season do, at least in the off season, do boxing to maintain fitness, and I think irrespective of whether they want to do a career, but also from the point of view of discipline and sort of fitness too. Do you see it as a good thing too, Hannah, for someone to go in there and sort of improve their fitness, or just some discipline, really?
Do you know what? I think boxing is one of those sports where I always say to people, I have people come to my boxing classes and they're like, "Oh, I've done an Ironman, or I did this and I've done that, and I've done a marathon." I said, "Yeah, I'm sure you're very, very fit for that, but are you boxing fit?" Because it's one of those. It's completely different. It uses your whole body, and also it uses your mind a lot, which I think what people enjoy coming to classes, to do boxing, because after a stressful day at work, you have to concentrate when you're doing boxing, and it's a nice sort of relief to switch off from everything else outside of work. And it can also help you feel so much more confident in yourself. It's not like you're going to go out and start a fight with somebody, but you just feel stronger and more confident in your personality and feel better, So I always encourage people to give it a go, because it's a great, especially if you love going to the gym, it's a new sort of level of fitness for you to try out.
Definitely. That's really, interesting. Obviously, coming from someone who's achieved what you've achieved, people listening, it's really powerful for them to hear that. And in terms of your sort of career in resilience and wellness work, the consultancy work you do, can you just tell us a bit about that, Hannah, what that involves, the resilience and wellness consultancy work that you do?
Yeah, so I work with a company called Seven Futures, and I was approached by the owner of it, Mark, and he's got a few of us there, some from the sporting background, some Olympians, and myself as well. And we tend to work with big companies such as like National Rail, for example, just doing various health and wellness days. And often when I go to these events, I do talks about how to build resilience and also building confidence, especially females in the workplace and stuff like that. And it's something that I never really thought that I would be ever involved in, but actually what my two jobs really work well for helping to give a little bit of advice and share my experiences and hopefully inspire people to try things differently and approach it a different way, and also just be a little bit more confident in what they can do. So yeah, I really quite enjoy doing it, and it's great to meet different people and hear from them and hear what their sort of story is.
Yeah, no, I think it's really sort of inspiring, Hannah, because you've sort of, your boxing career, you've got the music as well, and your academic, you've sort of got along that road. I think you've sort of, it's quite inspiring for our listeners to sort of hear that and think, okay, who knows, if you sort of give something a go, you just never know where you could end up really, but sort of it seems like you really enjoy it too. And I think the other thing I was going to sort of, in terms of your own vision, obviously you probably want you hold certain things close to your chest, but where do you sort of see yourself from where you are now? You've achieved so much, going forward, sort of where do you see things for you moving forward?
I think for myself, obviously I want to achieve the next step with my boxing career and become world champion again, and I would love to unify a division. That's sort of my goal. So yeah, the next step would hopefully become world champion again and unify that division. But long term, I actually am very keen to start learning how to do a bit of commentary. I've had a bit of experience in it, in sports commentary. I don't think there's very many female commentators, and we could always do with a few more.
Absolutely, yeah.
But I'm actually doing some commentary for a boxing show in Scotland this Saturday, the first one back after the pandemic. I was meant to be fighting on the show, but I'm now going to be doing some commentary because it's a lot of my stable mates, the guys I train with at home here. So yeah, no, I'm very excited about it, and it's an area that I'm quite interesting because I get to be geeky about a topic that I really like. And in a sport that obviously I've been part of, so that's sort of my long-term goal with that.
Brilliant, yeah, and I'm sure you'll sort of achieve, certainly when you put your mind to something, and you do achieve it, so that's for sure. I don't think anyone would bet against, anything you sort of set your mind to. And you mentioned there about sort of people getting in touch, and do you have like social media people can sort of maybe follow or maybe see what you're up to or get in touch or anything like that you can share?
I do actually, yeah, and I made it quite easy for everybody because sometimes I know it's quite difficult to remember all the different names for handles for various things. So for my Twitter and my Instagram account, it's team_Rankin. That's RANKIN. So it's all under that, and my professional Facebook page is Hannah Rankin Professional Boxer, and I come up there. But most things will come under team_Rankin.
Brilliant. Yeah, no, that's fantastic. And I really want to thank you for coming aboard the show, Hannah. It's been really interesting. Our listeners, no doubt, have found that really, really fascinating, and will certainly keep an eye out for your career and sort of moving forward. So it was great of you to join us. So I really want to thank you for that. Hannah Rankin, kindly joining us on the show, former IBO world champion, former WBC Silver Champion, professional musician, resilience and wellness consultant for Seven Futures. Been really kind of her to join us on the show and give us an insight into her career on Salford City Radio 94.4 FM, the Friday Sports Show with your host Jimmy Petruzzi.